Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to go over the list I've prepared for an upcoming PPTQ. Actually, as we speak, that PPTQ is going to be starting in about 10 hours. Um, so I just came from FNM, which is one of the resources I use to test because I don't have a full testing team together. And this is what I settled with for our final list. Only got about one card in the 75 that I still am debating, and we'll get to that a little later. So as you can see on the screen, I'm running a blue-black control list. It's a pretty stock list all in all, with 2 copies of the Scarab God and 3 copies of Torrential Gearhulk as our finishers. However, this is slanted a little bit more towards improving the mono-red matchup, because in the little bit of testing that I have been able to do, just with a local friend, the mono-red matchup was basically unwinnable with my previous build. The previous build was running none of the Moment of Cravings because I hadn't updated the list since Rivals came out, and was running 2 or 3 copies of Essence Extraction. However, Moment of Craving has really swayed this matchup back into our favor, which also coincides with the banning of Ramunap Ruins and Rampaging Frostodon. So that improves this matchup considerably, and I think puts blue-black control in a much better position than it was previously. So taking a look at the deck list, we've got 4 Drowned Catacombs and 4 Fetid Pools for our dual lands. I'm running 2 Field of Ruin, mostly because my local store didn't have 3 copies. 1 If Near Dead lands, 1 Ipnu Reveillette, 6 islands, and 7 swamps. So I'm biasing a little bit more towards swamps because, as I said, I want to make sure I have shored up the red matchup, which means I want to have a swamp on turn 1 for a fatal push whenever I'm on the draw. The If Near Deadlands is also a hedge against this, just giving me a little bit of utility once we do grind them out. If we're still alive and we start to flood out, we have another form of interaction with that If Near Deadlands. The Ipnu Rivulet is a hedge against the mirror, because a lot of times that will come down to decking, as we have a lot of answers for each other's threats, and none of the threats that are really offered in standard at the moment are quite resilient enough for the answers supplied by the control decks to deal with them. At least none of the threats that the control decks themselves are running. Moving on to our spells, you'll see 4 copies of Fatal Push. It's just great in the meta. So many of the decks are down to the ground. You just need to be able to interact on the first few turns of the game, and people will be continuing to run out 1 through 4 drops late into the game. Also running 2 copies of Censor, 1 copy of Consigned to Oblivion, 3 copies of Essence Scatter, 3 copies of Moment of Craving, 1 copy of Pull from Tomorrow, and 2 copies of Search for Escanta. So the Moment of Cravings, as I mentioned previously, are a hedge against red. However, they also hit a number of the other creatures in the format. However, I haven't committed to the full 4 of, as I've seen some people running this list do so. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up some information from MTG Goldfish here real quick. So one of the big weaknesses I've seen in the deck for red was the fact that they couldn't kill Kari Zev without a Fatal Push or a Vraska's Contempt. I didn't really want to strain my Vraska's Contempt when they need to be going after Hazarats and Glorybringers to also go for 3 Kari Zevs. So for that reason, I have included in my list 2. Let me get this to go away, I apologize. 2 copies of Essence Extraction at the 3-drop slot, because that conveniently deals with Kari Zev, but also matching up well against a few of the other decks in the meta. Namely, thinking of Grixis Energy, which just so happens to be the second most heavily played deck list according to MTG Goldfish. So in this particular matchup, Moment of Craving doesn't match up nearly as well because the majority of their creatures have over 2 toughness. You can see they're a little bit of a bigger deck than Mono Red, obviously. However, they do have Glint Sleeve Siphoners, so we don't board out all of our Moment of Cravings. We just make sure that we have answers to Whirler Virtuoso and Rekindling Phoenix in the form of those Essence Extractions and Vraska's Contempts. So that's the reason I chose that particular suite of removal. We'll go ahead and get this out of the way, go back to the deck. Also running 3 copies of Disallow, 1 Wantu's Reckoning, and 2 Supreme Wills. The majority of lists aren't running any Wantu's Reckoning. I'm running 1 in the main and 1 on the side, because I imagine in Standard there's no way it's correct to not be running a sweeper if you're a control deck. That's one of our main benefits, just theoretically, in control decks, is the fact that we don't have creatures, so whenever that allows us to run sweepers, because we're always getting a X for 1 off of it, because we're almost never killing our own creatures. The split between Disallow and Supreme Will is partially because I didn't have a 4th Disallow, and partially because I think Supreme Will kind of makes up for itself in the late game. Traditionally, these effects where they're pay X lose value in the late game. However, Supreme Will allows me to dig 4 cards deep, either to find one of my threats, like Scarab God or Torrential Gearhulk, or to find one of my 3 copies of Vraska's Contempt. As far as card advantage goes, as I mentioned previously, we have Search for Azcanta and Pull from tomorrow. Search for Azcanta is by far our biggest form of card advantage. If you haven't seen this card in action yet, I don't know where you've been living under a rock or something, but this card is the Stone Cold Nuts. We're also running 3 copies of Hieroglyphic Illumination and 1 copy of Pull from tomorrow. Previously, I was running 3 copies of Glimmer of Genius. However, as I continued testing the more aggressive matchups like Mono Red, Red Black, Aggro, which uses Scrap Heap Scrounger and Rekindling Phoenix, and just has a lot of resiliency with its creatures. I noticed that sometimes in the early stages I would stumble either to hit my land drops or when I needed a removal spell on turn 3 and I just couldn't take both turn 3 off because I didn't have a removal spell and turn 4 off to cast Hieroglyphic Illumination to find it. So I think or to cast Glimmer in that case to find it. So I think the ability to cycle Hieroglyphic Illumination does put it slightly over the additional, not card advantage, but the card velocity. The fact that you get to see a maximum of 4 cards off of Glimmer as compared to 2 by Hieroglyphic Elimination. I think the cycling overcomes it because you still have to get to that 4 mana and be able to spend 4 mana on your 4th turn to get that card velocity and advantage. So I think the ability to cycle it makes up for itself there. Our threat package is 2 copies of Scarab God. This card is also just a great form of card advantage while also being a great threat. It just comes out of nowhere and provides a ton of damage within 2 turns. You're taking your opponent from 20 to 0 very easily. Torrential Gearhulk is also great. Another source of card advantage is you get to cast things back from your graveyard while also adding a 5/6 to the board. Its biggest weakness in the current meta is a Braid, and will be until it rotates out. So now move on to the sideboard a little bit. That was more the shell of the deck. Actually, before we go to the sideboard, let's go ahead and take a look at how this deck is positioned in the current meta. Let me back this up a page. So I believe that with the current list we're running, our mono red matchup is, I'm sure it's very close to 50-50, but I do believe we are slightly favored at this point with all the life gain and removal we have, as well as the improvements we get to make post-sideboard. From what I've seen, we're very favored against Grixis Energy. Just a matter of making sure we line up our Vraska's Contempts with the right kinds of threats, as well as just making sure we have an answer for an early Glint Sleeve Siphoner so they don't run away with the game. So this matchup plays up very much like a control mirror, just we are the bigger control deck. That happens to be my perspective of that matchup. Black-Green Constrictor, I unfortunately haven't had time to test against it all. However, as it is the most mid-rangey of standard decks at the moment, I imagine we're quite favored against it as a control deck, especially with our version having 2 copies of sweepers between main and side. For their strategy to work out, they need to commit multiple creatures to the board, and that just provides us with the opportunity to get card advantage by 4 for 1ing our opponent off of Bantu's Last Reckoning. one concern with this deck is the 2 main board Blossoming Defense, so we have to kind of be careful about whenever we are casting our removal spells. Sometimes we want to be casting them on our turn just to play around Blossoming Defense, particularly if we think they're holding it up, if they've given some indication holding up green for multiple turns in a row, something like that. Post sideboard, Vraska's a bit of an issue. However, we do have the our counter magic and Vraska's Contempt to deal with Vraska. Deadeye Tracker can be an issue. However, it's really just an issue with our late game, and it's not likely going to be alive at that point still. Yeah, there's not too much I'm worried about outside of Vraska. Tetsamok just dies to so much of our removal. Yeah, he has no resiliency at all. It's just a matter of lining up our removal or a couple of eternalized Scarab God creatures to beat him down. So I'm pretty sure we're favored against that matchup as well. Grixis Control. I haven't played against a full-on control version, just the energy versions. The only real concern here, I think, is Nicol Bolas. Aside from that, it's just going to play out very much like a blue-black mirror. They do have the 2 cut to ribbons, so that could be an issue. Looking at their sideboard, I don't see anything I'm too afraid of either. The Metallurgic Summonings could be an issue. That's actually a card I considered for my sideboard as well. However, I decided that specifically for the Control Mirror, however, I decided that a 5 mana enchantment wasn't going to resolve, and if it did, it was going to cost me all the spells in my hand to make sure it did resolve. So I backed away from that. Next is actually the mirror. I think our version is probably a little bit less favored in the mirror because they just have more counter spells, more threats. They play 1 additional Torrential Gearhulk. And they play Glimmer instead of Hieroglyphic. Supposedly this list does anyway. So I think our list is more likely to survive to the late game against the faster decks than this list is, but at the same time, they have more staying power. So it's essentially the same thing as our matchup with Grixis Energy, where we were just the bigger control deck. Now they are just the bigger control deck. So the pressure's really on us to be able to get in damage early and hopefully just cross the finish line in the last few turns. Red-black aggro, as I mentioned, is very similar to mono-red. It just uses a few more resilient creatures like Scrap Heap Scrounger. Mardu vehicles I haven't played against since Aether Revolt Standard. So I know that this is a deck that control decks traditionally struggle with. However, looking at it, there's nothing I'm too afraid of. I think we have answers for all of these, and it's just a matter of making sure we line them up correctly. Cut to Ribbons is a card that actually I think is underplayed despite being played in a few copies in the top 6 decks in the meta. I think this card's just fantastic. 2 mana for 4 damage to a creature, and then in the late game being able to just sweep life away from your opponent. I think it's awesome. Looking at the sideboard, Liliana. I know in our deck it isn't very good, but we don't have nearly as many creatures as some of these decks do. Treasure Map is a good source of card advantage. Chandra is a good threat, and Glorybringer is a good threat. I'm not too worried about this with our mix of counter spells and Vraska's Contempts. I think we'll be fine against this deck as well, especially considering Moment of Craving kills literally every other creature aside from Hazoret and the Glorybringers from the board. I think we're going to be absolutely fine against Mardu. And then this next deck is something I'm pretty concerned about. I've only played half a game against it. I proxied up a version and was trying to get in a game between games at FNM. And from what I saw in that matchup, we were going to get stomped. I think it really all comes down to how quickly they can fill their graveyard up to 6 cards, right? Sorry, guys. Yeah. So how quickly they can get 6 creatures in their graveyard, how much pressure they apply on us so that we have to get 6 creatures in their graveyard, so that they can go get their God Pharaoh's Gift. And then, so our whole point is to, or our whole strategy here is to either disallow these triggers or be able to bounce and have them discard the God Pharaoh's Gift or counter it on its way back down. If we can't do any of those things, we have the ability to try to just match them with our Scarab Gods. However, that's a little bit tough whenever we're investing 4 mana to create a token, and they're just doing it for free. So, there's a certain point in the game where that starts to favor us over them, simply because by the time we get to 8 lands, we're making 2 tokens to their 1. So, like I said, I'm not sure exactly how this matchup goes, but all indications were that it wasn't great. I'm hoping, though, because it's one of the lower prevalence decks, I won't have to face it. So this was the reason why I chose blue-black control for this particular PPTQ. I feel like it's favored against the majority of the decks here, the mirror and Grixis control being my main concerns for our particular version of the deck. The mirror, because ours is changed by 6 or 7 cards from this standard list. So let's go ahead and take a look at our sideboard and how that impacts the meta. So our sideboard consists of 1 Bontu's Last Reckoning, a second Bontu's Last Reckoning, a Consigned to Oblivion, a Crook of Condemnation, a Deadeye Tracker, 3 copies of Duress, 2 copies of Glintsleeve Siphoner, a Lost Legacy, 3 copies of Negate, a Sorcerer's Spyglass, and a Vizier of Many Faces. Now looking at this list, you can probably already see the card that's bothering me in the 75, and that's Sorcerer's Spyglass. I'm not entirely sure if this is the 75th card that I want to be playing. I was previously playing 3 copies of Glintsleeve Siphoner. We may end up back there, or this may end up as like a Nezahal or something similar to that. However, the majority of these cards here are self-explanatory. If we're playing against some type of mid-range strategy like Black-Green Constrictor, we board in the second Bontu's Last Reckoning. The Consign is actually great against a number of different things, whether that be Rekindling Phoenix, or it's really great against Hazoret, so it comes in the mono-red aggro matchup, because in order for them to attack or block with Hazoret, they have to discard down to 1 card in hand. So the Oblivion portion actually makes them discard their Hazoret, as long as you can go Consign, bounce Hazoret, you have 1 other card in hand, cast Oblivion when I untap, they have to discard their Hazoret along with their last remaining card. So that's actually fantastic tech for the mono-red matchup. Deadeye Tracker was a source of graveyard hate to deal with Scrap Heap Scroungers, Rekindling Phoenix, as well as the God Pharaoh's Gift decks. However, it's kind of fragile. It's nice that it's a source of card advantage as well as being a small threat, so that's why I'm playing one. However, Crook of Condemnation I feel is a more resilient form of graveyard hate and also just a very good source of graveyard hate. So that's why I did a split between those two. 3 Duress, because Duress is great in any number of these matchups. For mono red, we end up bringing 2 in. For Grixis, we bring a few in. I haven't considered bringing any in for Black-Green Constrictor. However, I'm not sure that we really need the improvement in that matchup, and I haven't had the opportunity to test that matchup. We bring it in every single control matchup, be that Grixis or Blue-Black or Approach of the Second Sun or any number of control grindy matchups. We bring it in. We may also bring it in against like Mardu vehicles because they bring in so many planeswalkers from the sideboard. Glintsleeve Siphoner is an all-star in the control mirror as well, just because it's a source of card advantage in the early game, and the majority of the time they're going to be boarding out cards like Fatal Push, or I don't even know what white is playing currently for the blue-white versions for early creature interaction, just because they never get to cast it against me because I never have any early creatures in Game 1, and they board them out for Games 2 and 3. So it's great because they board out those sources of interaction, and then we get in for 2 a turn because the Menace gives it a slight amount of evasion against the 1 or 2 big threats they play that we kill off. and again, we get card advantage the entire time it's on the battlefield. One Lost Legacy, because even though the approach players know that Lost Legacy is getting boarded in, that doesn't mean we still can just not board it in. They would have to board out all 4 copies of Approach in order for us to feel like we don't need to board it in. So I'm just going to continue to play with 1 on the sideboard until, I don't know, Approach rotates out of the format, or I guess Lost Legacy probably will first. 3 copies of Negate, again for the control mirror, as well as 4 cards like Chandra, any number of Planeswalkers, and even some vehicles if we really think it's necessary. Vizier is a great answer to cards like Carnage, Tyrant, or the name's escaping me at the moment, Bristling Hydra. Anything with hexproof, it's a great answer to, as well as just being a value creature if we need to board it in the control mirror to copy our own Gearhulks, or whatever their threats are that they've landed. So we come back now to Sorcerer's Spyglass, and I'm gonna try to not try to convince myself, because we need to find the right answer here, but I'm gonna talk through this with you guys while once again referencing the current metagame. So mono red, I'm not bringing it in because I don't have the additional sideboard slots. I only have 3 cards I board out and in against mono red, that being Pull from Tomorrow, 1 Search for Mezcanta, and Bantu's Last Reckoning, and bringing in 2 copies of Duress and a Consign to Oblivion. Grixis Energy. Let's see what kind of activated abilities there are here that we could hit. These are all triggered abilities. This, we could hit Whirler Virtuoso if we needed to. We can't hit the token because you have to name a card. We could hit Glorybringer, but this really doesn't apply to us because our creatures, well, we don't have a lot of creatures, but also they all have more than 4 toughness. We could name the Scarab God if they get it down on top of us before we play our own, but we have other answers to that. Torrential Gearhulk, no. Chandra, we could definitely name, just not have to deal with it later on in the game, I suppose. Just name it on turn 2 so we don't have to worry about it. Although they probably don't board out Abrades. It might just be a good distractor for the Abrades so that we can resolve the Gearhulk and not have it just immediately die. Direfleet Daredevil, no activated abilities. Oh, you can name Eternalize, I believe. Let me... Yeah, that's a cool one, right? Yeah, sorry guys. I can't quite see that because of the glare on the screen as I'm recording here. So you can name any of the Eternalized creatures. I guess that makes it a little bit better. That might even make it worth boarding in the mono red matchup to name Earthshaker Kenra's or Chandra's, or perhaps even Hazred if we felt like we really needed to. That's really it as far as targets and Grixis go. Black green, I think these are all triggered abilities. Walking Ballista isn't. Walking Ballista is an activated ability. We could board it in as an answer for Vraska. I could definitely see doing that. But that's really it. I don't think they're bringing in Thrashing Brontodon against us because we don't have any artifacts or enchantments in the main board. So we probably will bring it in for Black-Green Constrictor just to name Vraska and not have to deal with her. I think we definitely board it in against Grixis Control so that we can name Nicol Bolas, as well as naming the Scarab God, I suppose, if they get that down before we do. That's really the only other thing we would name, though. Red-black, we could name Scrap Heap Scrounger, Earthshaker Kenra, or Chandra. I'm not entirely convinced. I suppose we can name any of the utility lands as well. The Scavenger Grounds, or in the case of other decks, Ipnu Rivulet and If Near Dead Lands. The green one I don't know the name of, and the white one I don't know the name of, but their considerations as well. But the real matchup I considered this card for, I'm sorry guys, it's almost 2 in the morning. I'm getting a little bit tired. That's why I'm touching my face so much. The real matchup I had considered this for, though, was the God Pharaoh's Gift deck. And that is to turn off Gate to the Afterlives. I think we need to really maximize on our possibilities of shutting down Gate to the Afterlife, be that through maximizing on disallows, duresses, when we're on the play negates, and also adding in the 1 Sorcerer Spyglass. So I think there's enough stuff in the meta to justify playing a 1 of in the sideboard. However, I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of this tournament tomorrow I'm telling you I should have been playing a Glyph Keeper or a Nezahal or some type of resilient threat for the control matchup, or possibly even just a 4th Moment of Craving for Mono Red, or even like the blue Jace's Defeat, the 2-mana counter spell that counters any blue thing. Like, there are just a ton of different options that we could play this last sideboard slot as. However, I think we're going to go ahead and stick with this 75. As I mentioned, again, that is the one card that's concerning me. I'd like to hear your guys' feedback on this list. I'm going to be checking back in with the tournament report tomorrow afterwards. I just wanted to get you guys this video up before I leave for the PPTQ here in about 10 hours. Well, here in about 8.5 hours. So we'll see how that goes, and I'll be checking back in with you. I'm going to try to take some detailed notes between rounds or during rounds about what's actually happening, how I think I'm playing, whether I have established a good flow of recognizing my opponent's plan and formulating my own plans. I felt, as crazy as this is to say, I felt a small change today at FNM where I was just constantly reminding myself, you have to have a plan, and I wasn't playing as much by intuition as I normally do. So hopefully I can continue that to tomorrow, and hopefully we'll get a good result at this PPTQ. But my main goal is to be satisfied with my deck choice, which I am. I feel like I've utilized the few resources I have to the best of my ability to optimize this deck to beat Mono Red, while also not giving up its late game viability. So I feel good in my deck choice, which is one of my main goals going into a tournament. And I also feel good, I hope to feel good about the technical play I use tomorrow. So, looking forward to giving you guys a tournament report tomorrow. You'll get one regardless of whether I go 9-0 or 0-9. So we'll look forward to that and hope that it is the former of those two. Have a good night, guys. I am about to get some sleep before this PPTQ. See ya.